Good evening, everybody. Are we ready to start? Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sheep Scab Breaking the Cycle. I'm Michael Calvert, head of beef and sheep branch at CAFRE, and this night is going to focus on sheep scab. I'm just going to share my screen here, and then we'll be able to get going. So sheep scab is a serious issue in Northern Ireland at present, and it poses real challenges from both a welfare perspective and a financial sustainability perspective. And one of the previous events that we had, we were told that you're looking at around £18 per ewe in production losses plus treatment. So it's a considerable challenge. I'm delighted that we've been able to run these events with the support of our industry partners, and without them we wouldn't have been able to pull this together. We've had advice and support, and they've been a great sounding board, and I suppose we just want to give credit to everybody that's been involved in the planning and promotion and so on of the event, and hopefully it'll be a good success and we'll learn plenty. Special thanks to the UFU for hosting the webinar tonight, to Kelly and to Ruth for their support and facilitating the event this evening. I'm not going to ramble on about the topic tonight. I think the speakers that we have will do that for me, and much better than I can. So I think just to do the introductions we've got tonight, we're going to have a talk from Dr. Stewart Burgess from the Moredun Research Institute. We spent a couple of days with Stewart last week in the in-person events that we held, and we were with him for a couple of days around those. And his enthusiasm and passion for sheep scab is nearly as transmissible as the scab itself. So we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts again tonight, Stewart. Stuart's going to give us an overview of scab and some of the work that he's been doing in various parts of Scotland and here in Northern Ireland as well. We'll follow Stewart with Gareth Beacom, who's a beef and sheep advisor with CAFRE, and he's going to speak to us about the practicalities around dipping, the do's and don'ts, the regulations, and the things that you need to be thinking about. So this event is being recorded, so if anybody that you know misses it, you'll be able to find it on the UFU website. And if you've got questions as we go along, there's the Q&A function. So if you put your questions in there, then we'll have a panel discussion at the end, and we'll try and get as many of those questions answered as possible. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Stewart, and yeah, we'll enjoy the evening.
Thank you very much. If you can stop sharing, Michael, then it will let me share my slides, or maybe I can do it here. Let's have a look. So hopefully you'll now be able to see that slide. Is that looking okay? Fantastic. You can all hear me okay, so great. Yeah, so look, thank you very much, obviously, for the opportunity to come and talk to you all today. I appreciate it's via a webinar on this occasion. But as Michael said, I was very fortunate enough to come out to Northern Ireland last week and talk to a lot of folk about sheep scab and sheep scab control. So some really good discussions, and hopefully, yes, there's some bad news around this disease, because it's not a pleasant disease at all. But I'm hoping that there is some good news messages in here, and things that we can all hopefully learn from that we can apply on our own farms and on our clients' farms as well. So hopefully there'll be something here for everybody. But I'll just get kind of started, and what I'm going to cover is an introduction to the disease, to sheep scab, sort of break down some of the mysteries of the disease, and some of that stigma that often follows the disease as well. Just sort of highlight why that is not really, shouldn't really be a big factor when it comes to controlling the disease. Give you some information on the tools we have to control it and how best to use those, and then some examples of how we've applied those working with farmers and crofters across the UK, to try and get on top of sheep scab at both a local and a regional level. And then hopefully you'll all leave having learnt something about scab. I'm not going to go massively into the practicalities of dipping, because Gareth's going to give you some really nice kind of some nice tips on the practicalities of that. But I'll just cover the basics of dipping best practice as well. Let me just go here. No. Okay, so here, so sheep scab. Sheep scab is caused by this mite in the top corner there, Psoroptes ovis. It is, a really, really kind of awful disease that this causes. You can see some mites here. You will never see this many mites again in one place. So at least be thankful for that, and everybody will be itching by the end of this talk as well. So so they're pretty horrible little things, and they don't pierce the skin, they don't bite, they don't suck blood from the sheep. They simply go onto the skin, and they basically abrade the skin, and then they, in their fecal pellets, they deposit allergens, and those allergens trigger an inflammatory response in the skin. That inflammatory response results in a fluid or exudate. And then the mites are pretty clever, because they generate that fluid on purpose by dropping those allergens onto the skin. And then they feed on that fluid, because there's lots of lovely protein in there and fats and so on. And that's what they use as their source of nutrition. And then as that fluid dries, it forms lesions or scabs, hence the disease sheep scab. And then what happens, and I'll describe this in a second, is that as the mite population grows, as more and more mites develop and reproduce on the back of that sheep, the lesions get bigger and bigger, and then the clinical signs, the itching, the scratching, the rubbing, become more and more pronounced. And you'll see that as the disease progresses. And those signs are pretty horrendous. You've got itching, rubbing, wool loss, restlessness. If you can see the sheep in the foreground there, it's pretty distressed. It's lost quite a lot of wool. A lot of that it would have pulled out itself. And often with scab, what you'll find are wool plugs between the teeth, and that's a pretty good sign. You'll see this animal in the background here rubbing up against that post, and then really far in the background there, this animal that's doing this sort of neck arching and then lip smacking behavior, which is really characteristic of sheep scab. And if you do suspect an animal of having scab, this isn't a complete diagnosis, but often if you then touch the irritated areas on that animal, you'll see they'll start to nibble. And it's because you're just irritating that incredibly itchy part of skin, and so they'll nibble away, because of course they can't reach around to grab that. So that's a good indication that sheep scab is a problem, but by no means a good diagnostic test. This just shows some sheep that have been infested. The mites have been put between the withers there, and you can see again that lip smacking behavior, that real high levels of irritation, kicking and sort of scratching away at their own flanks. And basically, this will preoccupy them. They will not do anything else. They will not sleep well. They won't rest. They won't eat, and they won't put on weight, and they won't move on. And that's some of the big problems that scab causes. So generally, it's caused by direct contact. So that's one animal moving up against another animal. So that's how it spreads within a flock. But between flocks, it will spread by pieces of wool left behind on a handling facility, on a weigh crate, at a bucks or fank, and also if you're using shared trailers as well, then that can be a good way to spread about. And that's what fomites are. Fomites are really a term we use to say that piece of wool, something that's off the animal but can then be picked up by another animal. And there's a big issue in the country with animals that are infested with the mites but aren't yet showing signs of disease. And I'll kind of explain what that means just now. So these two graphs, the one on the left here, I don't know if can I share a pointer on this? I don't know if that works, but I'll just describe it because, oh, hang on, no, what's that? That's
your mouse is coming through, Stuart.
Okay. Okay. Oh, perfect. Okay. Great. Thank you, Michael. Yeah. So the graph on the left here shows the lesion. So when I mentioned about those scabs growing, the lesions growing, that's what I'm talking about here. So this lesion here to start with, this is weeks on the bottom here, and that's a 3 week period there where there's really no lesion development at all. And then the graph on the right hand side shows the numbers of mites that are in that lesion. And you can see that that lesion here started with just 10 mites. And after 3 weeks, there are still 10 mites. There's not a lot of mites there, but they're reproducing and they're laying eggs, and those eggs are hatching. And then you're getting juvenile mites coming out, and then they start to move through the life cycle. And what you see here then is after about 3 weeks, you start to see this really, really quick, rapid increase in the numbers of mites. And that is followed by a rapid increase in the size of those lesions or scabs. And it's then when you see those scabs and lesions developing, that's when the sheep will start to show those physical signs of being affected by scab. But of course, in this case, this is an artificial infestation. There's a 3 week period there where nothing's really showing. But in a field infestation, it could take many weeks, many months before these lesions start to develop. And so the scab might not present itself, for a few months. It might not even present itself until the next year. And the reason for that is that sheep scab is very seasonal. So it's a disease really of the late autumn into winter, with really the peak of sheep scab being in March. And that's really because the mites need that warm, moist, fully fleeced environment to maintain their own life cycle. And in the summer months when we've shorn the sheep, there's lots more UV light because the days are longer. The mites do not like UV light, and so therefore the mites don't survive as well. But during the winter, also, we tend to house animals more closely together. That means there's more opportunities for them to contact each other and for the disease to spread from one animal to another. And so that's one of the big issues we have to contend with is subclinical disease. And often those sheep can get moved around without us even knowing that they have sheep scab. And so that's a really big problem when we talk about controlling the disease. Another thing that's really important is that the parasite, the mite, can live off the host for about 2 to 3 weeks. Most of it has to carry out its life cycle on the host. Once it comes off of the host, it's slowly dying, and it's then got 2 to 3 weeks to find another sheep. And so that's really important when we think about control, because if we treat sheep scab with something that gives us a persistence against reinfestation, and for example, the OP, the organophosphate plunge dip, gives us about 60 days of protection. And that's way beyond that life cycle of 2 to 3 weeks. And so that means that we can break that cycle of infestation. So that's a really important tool then when we're controlling scab, to make sure we're using something that gives persistence against reinfection. Once it gets into a flock, it can spread really quickly. And by the time you see those clinical signs, by the time you see the tip of that iceberg, 60 to 90% of the flock are going to be infested. And so it's often too late by that point. And then, of course, you've got to act. Sheep scab, we've got a bit of a checkered history of scab in the UK. So we eradicated it in 1952. It was reintroduced from the Republic of Ireland in 1972 into the port of Liverpool with some infested sheep that then went on to spread scab throughout Lancashire. So it was a pretty quick spread, and because we'd eradicated it for the best part of 20 years, we had a lot of sheep that were very naive for scab, hadn't ever seen it before, and so the infestation spread quite rapidly. We were very close to then eradicating it again using compulsory organophosphate plunge dipping. And then just really when we got it down to about 50 or 60 flocks in the whole of the UK that were actually infested, we took our foot off of the throat of sheep scab, and we deregulated it and removed that need for compulsory dipping. We're not going to go back to compulsory dipping. There's a number of reasons why that won't happen. And so we now have to think about other ways of dealing with this disease. It's endemic. 10 to 15% of farmers experience scab each year. The last time we looked, which was about 20 years ago, 8 to 10,000 outbreaks a year. It's only gone in one direction since then. The overall cost to industry are really astronomical, 80 to 200 million pounds per year. that's coming off of our bottom line in terms of production. So that's a huge impact. And Michael kind of mentioned this. The cost of scab to an individual farm is about £18 per ewe. So that's a huge economic burden for you to have to carry when you have an outbreak of scab. So controlling scab will hopefully save you that money per ewe. So you have to have that figure in mind when you're thinking about the cost of treatment and so on as well. There's some challenges to control. We've only got two treatments. We've got the ML, the macrocyclic lactone. That's the injectables. So things like, Dectomax and Cydectin and so on. And then we've got the OP, the organophosphate plunge dip. So that's your gold fleece. There's no new actives on the horizon. So that's kind of what we have. I said earlier, we're not going to go back to compulsory dipping. Routine prophylactic treatment. So people often just treat routinely for scab. That's fine if you're in a high risk area. And by high risk, I mean, so first of all, common grazing. I know in Northern Ireland, this isn't such a problem, but certainly where I've just come from on the Isle of Lewis, that's a big issue. There's a lot of common grazing, and that increases your chance of having scab in your flock by tenfold. And there's also a high risk of having scab in your flock if you share boundaries with other flocks. That's just by going to increase your chance of getting scab because the risk is much higher. So if you're in those areas, then yeah, you do probably want to think about some kind of preventative treatment or coordinated treatments. But if you're not, then you might want to think about whether testing might be a better option for you. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Non-validated means of control are a challenge. So we are certainly had seen an increase in the use of showers and jetters. These do not work to treat sheep scab. They do not get the active down to the skin, which is exactly where the mites are. And I'll show you a demonstration of that in a little while. And what they will do, they'll look as if it's worked. It will appear, it will lessen the symptoms because it will kill a lot of the mites, but it won't kill all of the mites. And then as that active wears off, the active that you have managed to get there with a shower or the jetter will wear off, and those mites will simply then re-establish. But that might not happen for 3 months, 6 months down the line. Again, it might not happen until the next opportunity for the mites to thrive the following winter. And it's then when it will hit again. And by that point, you're not making that connection with, oh, well, it must have been the jetter, it must have been the shower, because by then there's so many other things that have happened. So showers and jetters, bad. They give sub-therapeutic doses, and sub-therapeutic doses mean that the mites have an opportunity to develop resistance because we're not killing all of the mites. And so we really need to avoid that happening with the organophosphate. Some advantages. I apologise that Northern Ireland isn't on this map. We were not able to get the Northern Irish data to generate this map, but we are trying to work on that. But what you can see here, where the heavy red colouring is, that's risk of sheep scab. It's not outbreaks of sheep scab, it's risk. And where I've just come from on the Isle of Lewis, there's lots of common grazing, contiguous boundaries. So the crofting system, you have lots of single fences. So you can see the risk of having scab up there is really high. And then around the Welsh border regions, the northwest of England, the southwest of England, and then the northeast and southwest of Scotland. They're the kind of high risk areas certainly in GB. But these are advantages because these are control points. We can then focus our efforts on there and we'll be able to show an impact there, but it will also have an impact on the spread of the disease to other parts of the country. So these are good opportunities to actually make some difference. What is crucial, and this is something that we've clearly shown over the last few years, is that you have to coordinate your efforts. There's no point one farmer treating sheep scab and then the next farm bordering with them not doing it. And again, not doing it in a similar time frame because you've got that persistence against reinfestation. So if we use that, you've got an 8-week window there using the organophosphate plunge dips. So if people coordinate their treatments, it gets rid of scab. It breaks that cycle of it spreading from one farm to another. So we have to start thinking about it collectively. And quite clearly, whatever we've done since 1992 hasn't worked. So we do have to think a little bit more creatively. We have resistance to those injectables. We reported that a few years ago, and there's clear spread of that across the UK, and we have seen cases of that now in Northern Ireland as well. But they're not everywhere, but we do need to be aware of those, and if we treat with an injectable and it's not working, then we need to think, have we done it correctly? Have we administered the drug correctly? Have we dosed it correctly? And if we have, then we need to start thinking that maybe we might have a case of resistance here. And if we do have that, there is a good news, because if we then treat those animals with an OP plunge dip, it breaks that resistance. It kills those mites that are resistant to the injectables. So that's a positive. But do not go from one injectable to another, because they all use the same active chemical, and so the mites are resistant to all of them if they are resistant. So diagnosing scab, this is a challenge. This is not easy. Look, in this case, I've shown you here, there's lots of wool on the ground. This ewe looks pretty ropey, and you could have a fair guess at saying this might be scab. You can see on the lamb here, there's some areas of discoloration where it's been nibbling away at its fleece. And you would get the vet along. They would take a scalpel blade. They're not cutting the animal at all here. They're simply using that blade to pull at a 45-degree angle at the base of the skin. And this is really important because the mites are not in the wool here. Sending wool samples is completely pointless. The mites are on the skin at the base of the wool. And so that's where you need to take that skin scraping from. But you need to take the skin scraping from somewhere where you can find the lesions. And those lesions, as I've sort of shown earlier, aren't always apparent. And so this method, although if you find one of these then under the microscope, which is your sort of sheep scab mite, that's great. That's a really, really clear diagnosis for sheep scab. That's great. But if you don't, it doesn't mean that that animal does not have sheep scab, because it's really hard to prove that using this technique. And the reason for that is the sensitivity. The possibility of using a skin scrape to find sheep scab, if it's there, can be as low as 20% using that technique. And that's a pretty poor diagnostic test. So what we've done with funding from CAFRE and more recently from the Scottish Government is to design and build a blood test for sheep scab. And that blood test works pretty well. It, again, not unlike the skin scrape being about 20% sensitivity, this is up close to 99% now. And the specificity is very high as well. And most importantly, it will pick up scab before you see those clinical signs appearing. So that's really, really important if we want to get on top of this disease. It's not designed for use in a single animal. It can be used for single animals, but ideally you would use it at the flock level. So you take 12 sheep randomly from your flock, you blood sample those, and then those blood samples get sent off to the vet. The only place that's offering it, I think, that's easily accessible for Northern Ireland is BioBest here in Edinburgh. And I think they're charging about £90, something like that, for the 12 samples collectively. And then you need to obviously pay your vet to take the blood sample. So it's compared to the treatments, and certainly compared to the cost of the disease, this is a cost-effective way of diagnosing and then accurately treating sheep scab. It's been available for a number of years now, so we've used it quite a lot, and we know how it performs. But most importantly, it just gives us that important tool that we haven't had since we've been dealing with sheep scab. And yeah, I just mentioned about it being available through various schemes. Currently in Scotland, Scottish Government has this Preparing for Sustainable Farming scheme, and then farmers here in Scotland can access that and get free blood testing across Scotland, not just for sheep scab, but for a number of other endemic diseases. So again, those sorts of schemes can be quite useful for accessing that blood test. So the test works. I mentioned that the mites drop these little fecal pellets onto the skin, and those fecal pellets contain allergens. What they do is they break the skin barrier, and that allows those allergens to then penetrate into the skin. The host, the sheep's immune response sees them, the immune system sees them, and it develops antibodies. And those antibodies are then, given time, will be protective. But that's not going to happen for quite some time. And so they're not going to help in terms of controlling the disease. But what they are very good for is as a diagnostic. So the blood test detects those antibodies in the sheep's blood. But because it's the type of antibody it takes about 2 weeks before the sheep, after infestation, before the sheep has produced the antibodies, and we can pick them up in the blood. And so The other issue is that those antibodies stay in circulation in the blood for 3 to 6 months, even after successful treatment. And so that means that although it can tell us that sheep has been exposed to the scab mite, it can't distinguish between an animal that's been infested and one that's been recently treated. And that's just because those antibodies will still be circulating. We can use the test by doing paired serology. So we do one blood test to start with, and then after 2 or 3 weeks after treatment, we do another blood test, and we can look at the reduction in those antibody levels because we know they come down then. But that requires obviously taking 2 sets of blood samples. But what's really important when we're using the blood test is that we have information about the sort of history of scab in that flock and any clinical signs, but also any recent treatments as well. So that's all really important information when we're using that blood test. The reason for testing 12 animals is pretty straightforward. If we have just one infested animal in our flock, and we just test one animal, like in this scenario in the middle here, the chances of picking that up are pretty small. We can balance that by doing the opposite and just testing everything. But of course, that's going to cost us lots of money. We don't want to do that. So the balance is testing 12 animals, and that works for a group of any size. There's up to 2,000 or 3,000 animals in a group. And that gives us a 95% chance of detecting scab if it's in that flock at that time. So the test in that way can work really nicely. Just want to highlight, because I mentioned with that lamb earlier about some of the early signs of scab. So you can see again, these lambs, there's a little bits of discoloration, you know, around the kind of these areas that I'm kind of highlighting, particularly this orange animal here, you know, just on the flank there. And it's just indicative that they've been reaching around and just nibbling away at the fleece. So, and if that's sheep scab, you know, that would explain why they're doing that, because that itching that the mites cause will want them to try to alleviate that. And if you zoom in, you can see that a little bit more clearly. And then if we clip back the fleece, you can see on this animal, that's about a £2 coin size lesion. There's probably 50 to 100 mites in there. It's going to be really itchy, which is why that animal is obviously, you know, kind of nibbling away at it. And then if we look at the animal with the orange marker here, when we clip away the fleece, there's nothing here. There's no lesions to be seen, no mites to be found, but clearly something's irritating it. And now, interestingly, both of these sheep are positive by the blood test at this point. And so they're clearly infested. And in this case, we might be able to find that and take a skin scraping. But in this case, we've got no chance of finding that on a skin scraping. But the blood test is already telling us that that animal's positive. So it's a really good indication of how subtle some of those early signs can be. So testing advice is just assume everything that you're bringing onto your farm is a risk, particularly tups. That's a really high risk, because often we'll go to a market and buy tups. They've come from a producer. They've come to the market, they've mixed with other sheep in that market. There's lots of opportunities for them to be infested, and then we're going to take them back to our home farm. And if we're not quarantining them or holding them to try to prevent scab coming in, then that's a risk that we're then not managing. So the way to do that, certainly with testing, is that you need to hold those animals in quarantine and wait for 2 weeks before you then release them. And in the case of tups, then that means you need to plan things, of course. So you need to get them bought as early as possible so that you're not then rushing to get them out. So you've got that time to be careful with what you're doing. Because remember, this is a big risk. And so if you wait 2 weeks, and that's really important because those antibodies take about 2 weeks to develop. And so if they've picked up the infestation at the mart, which is possible, then we need to wait 2 weeks before the antibodies are ready to detect on the blood test. Then we can test them, and then we know whether or not we need to treat and what we need to treat with. And so we can then take action whether we need to or not. And you know, if they're negative, then obviously we're not going to have to treat for sheep scab. So that's great. If they're positive, we can treat, but we're using the correct treatment then at the right time. And that's really important, because not only is that going to save us money with unnecessary treatments, but it helps us to slow the development of more resistance as well, because we're not using those drugs unnecessarily. The other really important point is that the blood test doesn't cross-react with things like lice, but it obviously does work with sheep scab. So it allows us to tell the difference between a scab infestation and a lice infestation. And that's important because the treatment for those two diseases is different. You cannot use an injectable to treat for lice, and you can't use a pour-on to treat for sheep scab. So the only treatment that kills both of those is the organophosphate plunge dip. So again, it's just knowing what treatments to use, and getting an accurate diagnosis is a really good way of making that decision. So look, this is all idealized scenarios here. The ideal, if you want to have perfect quarantine, is that you have 3 meters apart, double fencing, and that will isolate your flock from everything else around it. That's not going to happen in the majority of cases, even if it's just 1 meter double fencing, even if it's just double fencing at the high risk area, so where you bound onto other flocks, and even if it's just using a bit of electric fencing, temporary electric fencing to keep your animals away from those shared boundaries at the high risk times of year, like now. This is when I'm starting to see sheep scab around the country. So this is when we need to be aware of it and take that action, because this is our high risk time of year. We've had the tops out with potential of bringing scab in that way, and we're going to start seeing it manifesting itself over the winter months. So this is the time to seal up those boundaries, do a walk around your property and just check for any holes, make sure the gates are secured, and just do some of those sort of relatively straightforward tasks that we can do to try to keep scab out. Trailers are a risk. Scanners, these are all risks. Anything coming onto your farm is a risk for bringing not just scab, but other things onto the farm. Shearers are also a risk. Certainly at the Moredun farm here, we have had a case of scab that was brought in with shearers. So, that's a challenge. And so just something you need to be aware of, and ask them, change the moccasins, change their oils, their oil skins, and just try to be aware of those risks of bringing scab in. Again, look, maintain fencing, and even if only at those high risk boundaries. And again, for routine preventative treatments, just be aware it might not be necessary unless you're in those high risk scenarios. This just highlights why biosecurity is so important for sheep scab. So again, you can see here these sheep down the bottom, they're completely naive. They've never seen sheep scab before. The animal that's just come in, we'll call her Itchy, clearly has scab and is very rapidly then going to share those mites with the rest of that group, and within 2 weeks, all of those animals become infested with scab. So when you're letting an animal in, when you're bringing it up in that way, it just highlights how quickly that disease can then spread. And so we just want to try to avoid that, because by the time that animal's in there, it's too late. Treatment. So we've only got 2 treatments. We've got the injectable MLs, the macrocyclic lactones, and then we've got the plunge dip. This table is really good because it just highlights what we have, but it also shows the complexity of what we have. In the ideal situation, if you can use the plunge dip, so gold fleece, the diazinon, that's the active at the top here, then do it. That's your gold standard for treating sheep scab. It has a reasonably short withdrawal period, 49 days, but it gives you at least 8 weeks protection against reinfestation. So not only does it treat it, it then prevents that animal from getting reinfested. And that's really, really important, because that's a great tool for then working collectively with our neighbours to make sure that we're all getting on top of sheep scab. The next best options are your Cydectin. So there's a Cydectin 1% there. It also gives you 28 days protection against reinfestation, but you do have to do 2 injections, and it's got a longer withdrawal period. The 2%, the long-acting Cydectin, is a really good option. It's a single injection at the base of the ear, into the skin at the base of the ear. It's not a very easy injection to do, so make sure you take advice and make sure you're getting it right. They also sell little applicators, the little guns that allow you to push up against the skin and then make sure you get the injection into the skin. It gives you 60 days protection against reinfestation. So the same as the OP, the plunge dip. Dectomax and ivermectin. Ivermectin, I would not recommend using an ivermectin-based treatment to treat sheep scab or prevent sheep scab. The problem is you have to give 2 injections. It only treats scab. It does not protect them against reinfestation. And the fact that you've got to give 2 injections 10 days to 2 weeks apart, it means you're going to miss something, in that treatment regime. You are going to miss one animal. And if you do that, then you've wasted it because they're not protected against reinfestation. So that one animal you miss is going to reinfest everything else. They're tempting because they've got a short withdrawal period, but you're wasting your money if you're using that method of treatment, in my opinion. The other option, this is a very popular option, and I like the option of Dectomax. It's intramuscular, so it's reasonably easy to administer. It only treats, it does not prevent, and that's a really big issue for Dectomax. So again, if you cannot move your animals to clean pasture after treating, you put them back into the same field. There's still going to be mites in that field, on fence posts, bits of tree, some around in the pasture as well. And if you just put those recently treated sheep back there, they will just get reinfested. And so that's a real problem because then you've just wasted that money and all that effort that you've gone to. So unless you've got spare pasture you can use, then do not use Dectomax to treat, and certainly not to prevent sheep scab, because it does not do that. And so my recommendation would always be, if you can, plunge dip. Okay. So the injectables, relatively easy to use, but underdosing is a big problem, and that's kind of why we have resistance to these chemicals now. If you use them correctly, they're pretty straightforward to do, but you've got to get some training to make sure you're doing it correctly. You don't need all the infrastructure that you would with dipping. You don't need the PPE. But as you've seen from that last table, there's quite a lot of confusing advice, different actives, different delivery routes, different doses as well. And again, if you can, weigh your sheep, of course, because that allows you to get accurate dosing. Of course, not everybody can do that. So even if you're just separating your animals by size, so the heaviest group, a mid group, and a lighter weight group, and then dose to the heaviest in each group, worst case, just dose to the heaviest animal. And that will help hopefully prevent you from underdosing. And if you underdose, you're giving then, remember, that subtherapeutic dose of the drug, and eventually the mites will develop resistance to that. So we need to be really careful. Just as an example, these sheep at the bottom here, there's a 20 kilo difference between those. So that's a big opportunity to get underdosing. So we just need to make sure we dose to the heaviest animal in these cases. And again, this just demonstrates that it's subcutaneous, it's into the skin. And so you have to pinch the skin, and those applicators really help you to do that, and go into the skin, not through the skin, and not into the wool, because it will not work if you do that. And if you get that right for every animal, perfect, great job. But you need to be really careful when you're doing that. And dipping is fantastic. It covers all the ectoparasites, so it kills lice and ticks, and it will kill keds and prevent fly strike for a period of time as well. So it's a really good broad spectrum treatment. As I mentioned earlier, it will kill the mites that are resistant to those injectables. So that's another real positive. If you have that failure of treatment and you suspect resistance, treat with an organophosphate, and that should hopefully get rid of those resistant mites for you. If you do it properly, and I'll describe that just now, then that plunge dip will give you 8 weeks protection against reinfestation. So it's a fantastic management tool to get on top of the disease. This graph's really nice. So this shows the concentration of the diazinon, that's the organophosphate in the dip, and then the time that the animal is in the dip bath. So just to give you an indication of what you have to do, you have to have every animal in that dip bath for 1 minute. And if you have them in for any less than 1 minute, there's a 60% failure to cure the disease. If they're in for 40 seconds, and not the minute, you can see you're getting 38% less of the chemical absorbed. And if they're in for 20 seconds, and this is what I see a lot of, 15, 20 seconds in the bath, you've got 50% less absorbed. So you're not doing it, you're not treating it, and you're no way are you going to get that 8 weeks protection against reinfestation. So take the time and do it right. And if you're using a contractor, make sure that they're doing it right. Sit there with a stopwatch, at least for the first few sheep, and make sure that they're getting that full minute in the dip tank. So the other issue here is that as the sheep go through the dip tank, the active, the diazinon, gets taken up into the wool grease, and that's really important because that gives us that persistence. That's how we get the 8 weeks protection, because it's held there in the wool grease, and that then keeps on making sure that the animals are treated. But as they go through, it means that more of the diazinon is getting pulled out of the dip bath. And so what we have to do is replenish the diazinon in the bath after every certain number of sheep. And that's what this graph shows. So this is your concentration of organophosphate. This is the number of sheep dipped, and that goes up to 500 here. And then the red line is your minimum effective concentration. So we do not ever want to drop below that minimum effective concentration. You can see we're starting here at about 400. We treated 50 sheep here, and that concentration of the diazinon has dropped down. So what we have to do is replenish. We add more active in after 50 sheep, and we see the level comes back up again. And then we dip another 50 sheep, and it drops down again. We add more, it goes back up again. And we're always doing this all the way through to make sure we stay above that minimum effective concentration. But what you'll notice is this zigzag line is always coming down. And the reason that it's always coming down at about, in this case, 500 sheep, is because we've got lots of soil going in there. We've got fecal matter, we've got wool, and all of that will bind up the diazinon. And so eventually it just simply won't get to the concentration it needs. And so after however many sheep, in this case 500, depends on the size of your dip tank, you've got to clean out the whole thing and start again with fresh water and fresh active. And if you want to make sure the job is getting done correctly, which of course you do, because you're paying for it. The other point here is that do not keep that dip wash to the next day. Don't store it overnight and keep it to the next day. First of all, it's a bacterial soup, and it is going to cause infections in your sheep. You're going to get things like lameness coming through, and if they're ingesting that kind of overnight dip, it's likely that they may also inhale some, and you can get things like pneumonia as well for that. But most importantly, it's not going to get to that concentration again, and so you're not going to get an effective treatment if you use it the next day. So get rid of it, start fresh again the next day. So what's critical? Every animal has to be in the bath for 1 minute. They need to have their head dipped under twice during that time. And it doesn't look very nice, but you've got to do that. And the reason is that the mites can survive inside the ear canals, around the nostrils, and around the eyes. And so if you're not plunging the head down into the plunge bath, they're not getting the chemical there. And those mites in those areas will simply survive. And when the chemical wears off, they'll come out onto the body and cause an infestation. So head under twice doesn't look nice. It's not pleasant, but the sheep will survive and they will thrive after. And that's the important thing. No shearing for 3 months, because it's obviously a nasty chemical. We don't want to be getting it on our hands. And you need to wait 14 days between dipping and using a levamisole-based wormer or drench. Disposal of that spent dip is an ongoing issue, and land disposal sites, so licensed land disposal sites, a lot of you will have these on your properties. That is still going to be our best option. But contractors, we're working on new solutions for contractors, and I'm happy to talk about that as well through the questions. This just shows why you have to use it as a plunge dip. So this is where the lesions are. This is at the base of the skin, not up in the fleece, not in the wool. And so using a shower or a jetter simply will not get the active down to the skin level where the mites are. It will give a subtherapeutic dose, and we will, at some point, if we keep doing this, get resistance to the organophosphates. And at that point, we will have nothing left to treat this disease with other than a gun. And that is not where I want to get to, because it's an important welfare disease. So we need to keep the tools we have. We do not want to get to the situation where we're getting to a welfare disease that we cannot effectively manage. Okay. So some good news. We are taking, I hope, a four-nation approach so UK-wide approach to the control of scab. We've run programs across England, in Wales, they're running a program at the moment. In Northern Ireland, we ran a program with Paul Crawford and Animal Health and Welfare Northern Ireland and AFBI. And the purpose of that program was just to try to get a gauge of the degree of sheep scab across Northern Ireland. And that gave as a good handle, first of all, to show, yes, sheep scab is a problem in Northern Ireland. You'll all know that, of course, but it just allowed us to find out where some of the problem issue areas were, and also how we could best work together to get on top of it. And so we've learned a lot of really important lessons there, and I hope that they will now be applied in future projects. In Scotland, which is obviously where I'm based, we've run quite a few programs, and I'm going to give you just a brief overview about the program we're running on the Western Isles of Lewis and Harris. So just to highlight, there's some reasons why this is a good opportunity to control scab now. We've got resistance to those injectables, but they do still work largely. We've got the OP plunge dips, so we've got those treatments, but there's nothing else coming on the horizon. So this is a good opportunity to use what we have while it is still working. Um, We've got will to act. The government have generally been very supportive of this. So we've got a Scottish and now a UK-wide sheep scab industry working group. So we're trying to pull all the different agencies and all the different kind of industry bodies together to come up with creative solutions as to how we can deal with the disease. Those injectables are largely still working. OP plunge dipping's efficacious if we do it correctly. So 1 minute in the bath, head under twice, no showers. We've got that blood test. We can use that to facilitate targeted treatment and also to test things like contiguous properties if we see outbreaks of scab, so we can follow that up. And ultimately, treating scab is a welfare disease. It's going to save you money from a production perspective, but it's also going to improve the welfare of your stock. And as we've seen in the parts of the country that are sheep scab free, for example, the Shetland Isles, they're able to then attract a premium for that disease-free status. So they get more money for their stock. And that's a really good benefit if we think about it as well. We're also developing a vaccine against sheep scab. That's still, probably 5 years away and for the future. But at the moment, we've got these tools and we want to try to get on top of scab. Okay. So the Lewis and Harris project. So this is an island. It suffers from outbreaks of scab, no different to the mainland. When I put up this sort of risk map that I showed earlier, you can see the big red kind of glowing part on the Isle of Lewis and Harris here. And that's just because the crofting system relies on heavy use of common grazing, and also they have contiguous boundaries. So you've got lots of crofts, all with single fences between them, all with sheep on, and it's really easy then for the disease to spread from one croft to another. So if they want to get on top of scab, they need some support, and that's really what we wanted to try to bring to the project. But it is an island, and so therefore there is the option of achieving some control, but we need to coordinate and support. So we worked with the Sheep Producers Association, the vet, and some trusted coordinators, local champions. And that's really important when we're trying to get people to work together, is to get them to work with people that they can trust and they'll maybe even look up to as well. So first we needed to show that there was an issue. So how do you do that? In our case, we went out and talked to the crofters about sheep scab, gave them information on best practice control, much like I'm doing with you today. And we agreed with the crofters that they agreed they wanted to do some blood testing. So we did that at pregnancy scanning. We tested 105 flocks with the local vet. And we found about 20 positives from that 105, 20 positive flocks. So 3 of them were clinically positive. So we were able to identify mites under the microscope. 17 were blood test positive, and those 3 clinicals are also blood test positive. Again, so you can see how that blood test gives you a better chance of diagnosing sheep scab, and that was spread over 5 clusters. So what we're talking there, 20 out of 100, around about a 20% prevalence. You can see the different areas that were affected: Northwest Lewis, Northeast Lewis, Uig, Ballallen, and then West Harris down here as well. This was 2 weeks before lambing. Again, as I mentioned, scab is a bad time of year. It runs into winter, and if we don't get on top of it ahead of lambing, it is extremely difficult to deal with. So we really needed to act quickly here, and so the only way we could do it was to go in with those injectables. But again, we were aware of the resistance issues, so we made sure that we were doing follow-up blood testing to ensure that the treatments were working as well. Okay. So coordinated OP plunge dipping. This is kind of, I guess, goes back to that kind of gold standard. So the pilot had given the evidence that there were some issues of scab up there, and then we developed that solution with the crofters as to how we were going to deal with it. We did more workshops, and then we came together to design a scheme, and the crofters wanted to do coordinated OP plunge dipping, but they wanted to use a mobile contractor because they didn't feel they had the facilities or the expertise to do it at any kind of scale. Because much like in Northern Ireland, a lot of their dip tanks have run into, are just not really viable anymore, and so they didn't have the facilities to do it themselves. And we didn't want any of this, no damming up rivers and putting the dip in there. So what we wanted to do was to use one of these more modern cage dipping systems. This is almost like a deep fat fry where you lower the sheep into the tank. Works really, really well and is much safer as well for the animals. We initially thought we'd focus on just those areas of concern, but actually the interest in with the crofters was so high that we decided we would just dip the whole island, and that's really, really ambitious. And I'm not sure I really believed at the start that that would be achievable, but I'm glad to say that the crofters were unbelievable. They've done an immense effort there. So important that all the sheep were dipped, so we provided support for gathering and back gathering to get everything off of the hill as well. We didn't want to leave any animals up there, any risk of leaving a residue of scab. It's not a bad part of the country to go and do gathering, so some wonderful scenery and a lot of effort in getting all of those sheep off the hill. In the first round of dipping, we dipped 28,500 sheep. That is an incredible effort because the flock sizes are small, much like in Northern Ireland, probably a bit smaller, to be honest. So that covered nearly 400 individual farms or crofts. So the logistics of that are immense. We also asked for the crofters to contribute 50 pence per sheep towards the dipping costs. And that's really important because we wanted them to be invested in it. We wanted them to make a contribution so that they had some skin in the game. And also, as you'll see, so that then at the end of the project, when the support starts to come off, that they were getting used to actually doing this themselves. And that will become apparent as we go through the next slide. So really, really good uptake in those first couple of years of the project. And actually, when we looked at the blood testing, we'd seen a big reduction. I'll show that in a second. But one thing that we didn't really anticipate was to see these other benefits that getting people to work collectively together. And remember, this is really, on the tail end of COVID here. So, people had got out of the habit of working together. And also, crofting is an aging demographic. And so, some of those practices just aren't done anymore. And so, getting people out, getting them working collectively together had this other huge benefit in terms of well-being that we hadn't really considered. And this one quote from one of the crofters, I think, is just fantastic. It just sums it up. You had something that probably hadn't happened for 20 years. We had 20 people at a township thank, stopping for lunch, having tea and sandwiches, and that's what used to happen, but that all stopped. And so getting that back, that communal work back was just incredible. And I think that, that's just a real big benefit of the project that we hadn't anticipated. I mentioned that the Shetland Isles is sheep scab free, so we wanted the crofters to learn maybe some of the lessons that Shetland had gone through. And so we took some of the stakeholders from Lewis and Harris up to the Shetland Isles, and they were able to then make some connections and see how Shetland had achieved that status. And this just shows one of the stops. So you can see the complexity. We were dipping into the night. And then this just shows the setup. So we've got a simple wrapper system here. We've got the mobile dipping lorry. We can set it up at the roadside. And if you look closely, you can see we've put a bloom in the dip. And the reason for putting the bloom in the dip was twofold. So first of all, so that we didn't miss any sheep. But secondly, so that everybody else could see who had and who hadn't dipped their sheep. So just to put a little bit of peer pressure in there. So moving on, then we ran some more workshops because we hadn't got everybody. We've got about 95% of the sheep. So we wanted to recruit in areas where maybe they hadn't engaged fully with the dipping. The crofters wanted to keep this going. They wanted to build on that success. Last autumn, we did a second round of dipping. More than 30,000 sheep dipped, 80 pence per head as well from the crofters. So that contribution's gone up a little bit. More blood testing to look at the impact. So we've gone from that initial 20% now down to just 1 or 2%, just 1 or 2 townships where we'd seen cases of scab. So we're really getting on top of it. We won an award, or the crofters won an award, which was fantastic. And then we also have had discussions with the crofters about buying their own on-island dipping facility. So they're not then in the long term reliant on a mobile contractor coming. Um, this year, we've done a third round of dipping. Harris was just finished last week. Another 30,000 sheep have now been dipped, and we've charged them £1.50 a head. So we're now at a commercial rate now for the dipping, and the crofters are still doing that. We're not supporting this project. We're not supporting gathering or back gathering. We're not supporting bringing the sheep together for the dipper. All of that's being done by the crofters now. So they're managing this themselves, which is just a fantastic legacy. And then what we want to do is keep it out. So how do we do that? So we offer further testing. We want to offer quarantine testing when we can. We're going to do a fourth round of plunge dipping next autumn, which I think will be the final round that we're supporting. And then we'll look at maybe a mobile dipping facility for the island at that point. Another risk they have is animals going to the mainland for overwintering. And so there's usually about 1,500 hogs that come back. They come back during March, April, just ahead of lambing. Huge risk coming back onto the crofts at that time of year. So we want to make sure that we're limiting that. So we're offering coordinated treatments for those animals. I mentioned TUPS being one of the highest risk activities. So we're making sure that everybody gets their TUPS in that dipper in the autumn before they're going out and servicing the ewes. So that's just covers some of the high risk activities. And then to the future, we're developing animal health and welfare plans specifically designed for the crofting situation as well. So working with a local vet to do that. We'll keep offering testing support. I spoke about looking at a mobile dipping facility for them. I've just seen this one, so this is really nice. I don't know if you can see that picture, but this just shows a simple kind of in the ground cage dipping system. It's a guy down in I think down in Wales who's designed this, and it's just on a forklift motor. That'll take about 12 ewes. And it's a really nice facility, at a small farm level. This sort of thing could actually be justifiable. I think they're £3,000 or £4,000, so whether we could get these sorts of things going into grant funding in the future, I think the options we're seeing and some of the innovation we're seeing is going to be incredible over the next few years. So I think there's a lot to look forward to in terms of treating sheep scab. The other option was to look at a Shetland or Orkney type system where you have more regulated animal movements on and off of the islands, where they use these dedicated cassettes or floats. And so with veterinary inspections, we don't have this on Lewis and Harris. So maybe that's something they want to look at as well at an island level. And we've also developed this pan-island network where crofters from Lewis and Harris and Shetland and Orkney and the vets as well, and the animal health professionals are getting together and talking about learning from each other. And that's really important. I'm going to show a 1-minute video which just shows that project. So please bear with me and hopefully you can hear this. So sheep scab is caused by a small parasitic mite that infests the skin of sheep, and that's incredibly itchy. The situation with sheep scab on Lewis and Harris is no different to the rest of the UK, but they do have a few unique challenges, amongst which is the over-reliance on common grazing, the contiguous nature of the crofting systems, and also the smaller flock sizes. And this meant that coordination was key. So we worked with the Sheep Producers Association and the local vet, and we also brought a mobile dipping contractor across from the mainland as well. We also provided support with gathering and back gathering to make sure that we got all of the sheep off of the hill. And then we tried to dip each township collectively and then move on to the next township. And in this way, we were able to dip the vast majority of sheep across Lewis and Harris. So I think that just highlights that collective working, which is really important. And these are my last slides now. So just to because I mentioned about Shetland being sheep scab free. They've been free of scab since 1994. It's the only part of the UK that's free of scab. It's a really privileged position and they see a premium for that. So they understand the benefit that they get and they want to protect that. Now, they had a breakdown about 2 years ago. They were using injectables as a quarantine treatment for everything coming onto the island. We think possibly some ML injectable resistant mites were on some of those imported sheep, and so the treatment didn't work. and that then had a breakdown. So to get on top of that, they brought in a mobile dipping contractor, treated everything, and then they did more follow-up visits and more testing to make sure that they got on top with it. And they've now re-secured that sheep scab-free status. And to prevent that happening in the future, they now have an on-island dipping facility. Everything that comes on now gets dipped. And so they've just really nailed it now, and they've got a really good system. Of course, not every animal can be dipped, and where the vet judges that an animal can't be dipped, then they require strict isolation of those animals on the farm, and then blood testing as well to show freedom from disease as well. Um, so what we wanted to do was just see, because Shetland's quite a unique situation, was to test over 2 years every animal that came onto Shetland, and it's predominantly tups that are coming on. So it's about 600, 700 a year. And what you can see from this graph, around the majority were negative, so that's great. That's what we'd hope. But 10% were positive, and another 6% were suspicious by the blood test. So that's giving us that kind of 10 or 15% prevalence at the nationwide level. In Scotland and in Northern Ireland, it will be no different. So that's our threat. That's our threat level of what we are facing when we bring animals onto our farm. 10 to 15% risk level. And we need to have that in our mind whenever we're trying to think about not just sheep scab, of course. We need to think about other diseases when we're quarantining. But certainly for scab, that's the threat. And so as long as we're aware of that, then we can take action to try and deal with it. So main outcomes, look, scab is endemic across the UK. It spreads at the local level from farm to farm, and then we have these long distant movements from markets, and that really amplifies the spread. There's a lot more scab than we I think that we thought, and that subclinical disease where they're not showing signs of disease is a real problem. If we don't change what we're doing, then things will not improve, and that's quite clear. Farmers, vets, all struggle to diagnose sheep scab based on clinical signs alone. That blood test gives us that opportunity to get ahead of that and also to coordinate our treatments and make the most of the two drug classes that we still have. And that coordination is absolutely critical if we want to deal with sheep scab successfully. And that's me. But really just to say, obviously, thank you for listening. Thanks to all the people who were involved in the project, but particularly to all the crofters who were involved in that, because they did all of the work and not me. I think we're going to save questions until the end. Is that right, Michael? So I'll stop sharing if that's okay.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Just while Gareth is getting his slides up there, thanks to everybody who's put questions in so far, and please keep adding more in, and we'll come to them then whenever Gareth has finished his talk.
Can you just confirm, Michael, if you can see those slides okay?
Yes, yeah, they're 100%. Thanks, Gareth.
Perfect. Thank you, Michael. And thank you, Stuart. Thank you for the interesting presentation. It's great to see the amount of work that's gone into scab and the positive results that have come out of it too. So thank you very much. So as Michael said, my name's Gareth Beacom. I'm a beef and sheep advisor based in Enniskillen, covering the west of the province here. So in my short presentation tonight, I'm going to focus on dipping. As Stuart mentioned, it's the first choice treatment option really for the treatment and protection of scab. I'm just going to cover some of the practicalities around dipping sheep, whether you get a contractor in or whether you do it yourself. I'll discuss some of the legislation around dipping sheep here in Northern Ireland and some things you need to consider if you're going to start dipping your own sheep. And finally, just a few tips around designing your own sheep dipping pen or yard if that's something you're interested in doing. So I suppose the first conversation to be had around dipping sheep is if you're going to get a contractor in or if you're going to do it yourself. Now, obviously, it goes without saying, if you have a sheep scab outbreak and you don't have your own dipper, your hands are tied. You're going to have to get a contract dipper. But even putting in your own dipper may be something to consider even in the long run. Even for smaller sheep flocks, it can still be cost effective and worthwhile thinking about. There's pros and cons of each. So I suppose starting off with a contract dipper, you'll not need a qualification for bringing in a contract dipper. They'll have that. You'll not have to worry about purchasing the dip. They'll purchase the dip and bring that with them, so that takes that side out of things. They'll provide a professional service. They'll be doing it day in, day out at certain times of the year, so they should be good at the job. It's in their interest to provide a professional service and be good at the job. From a labour point of view as well, dipping sheep is a labour-intensive day or a couple of days in some cases. So they will bring at least themselves anyway, which is an extra pair of hands on the day. So it'll allow you to focus more on keeping the sheep up to them and getting the sheep back out to the field, which can be one of the biggest parts of the challenges in dipping sheep. And it's cost effective, particularly for smaller flocks. It's a cost effective service, and for some people, it's a very good option and a very good way to get your sheep dipped. But also, I suppose, putting in your own dipper, it allows you to be more self-sufficient, less reliant on other people. We all have other things outside of the farm, other things we need to focus on. So it allows you to be self-sufficient, allows you more flexibility. Say, for example, in poor weather conditions, it's if those are happened on the day that if the weather turned on the day you plan to dip sheep, it allows you more flexibility then to rearrange and dip them on the day of your choosing, for example. It gives you more control of the sheep dipping process in terms of, as Stuart mentioned, making sure they're in there for the full minute, making sure that the dip concentration is right and handling the sheep is to your pleasing, etc. It gives you more control over the whole process from start to finish. It improves the long-term sustainability of your farm. You'll always have a way of treating sheep scab or any external parasites for that matter, should you ever need to do so. And it can be cost-effective in the long run. It's obviously an initial expenditure, but taking it over a few years, it can easily repay you back in the long run. So just a few wee things on dip and pen designs and things you may take into consideration if you are thinking of designing your own dipping yard. First and foremost, I suppose there's three key things we need to consider here whenever we're designing dip pens. That's safety of the environment, safety of yourself, and then I suppose just welfare and handling issues around the sheep. So I suppose to start off with the environment, it needs to be a dipper needs to be 20 meters away from any water course. Dip is highly toxic, as you know, as Stuart mentioned. It contains a range of organic compounds which pose a significant risk to the natural flora and fauna of the waterways. So as such, we must prevent their entry into the waterways. So a dipper needs to be 20 meters away from the water course. It also needs to contain have a draining pen attached to it so the sheep can stand there and allow the dip to drain off them and back into the dipper. So that needs to be sloped, and all dip needs to be catched and returned back into the actual dipper. It needs to be fully leak proof, so not block built. So most people putting in dippers now will go for one of these two options on the right. Your inserts, so you've got your plastic option or your precast concrete option as well. They can be long dipper or round dippers, whatever you prefer. A range of sizes as well. Just to give you an example there, 1,000 to 1,250 litres is generally a 2 to 3 ewe dipper. You can get bigger ones then for your larger flocks. 1,800 to 2,000 litres would be 5 to 6 ewe dipper. One thing I will say on that is if you only want to dip a small number of sheep, you still have to fill the whole dipper. So bear that in mind if you're thinking of purchasing one of the larger ones. So if you only wanted to dip a batch of purchased hoggets or rams, for example. So I suppose for that reason, I just noticed from traveling around farms, the smaller sizes are probably more that your 1,000 to 1,200 litre dippers are probably the more popular ones, and your dipper should be situated in an open yard as well, so not under a roof in the open yard, and that's just to protect yourself from the fumes. It is highly toxic, as I said, and we don't want to enclose those fumes, so it must be situated in an open yard. Just a few other things to consider. You'll need slurry tanker access to empty the dipper, so bear that in mind. You'll need access to your larger sheep pens, obviously, to keep the sheep coming, keep the day running as smoothly as possible. So you have to bear that in mind as well. You'll need water access to fill the dipper. And then just safety, you'll need a barrier or childproof cover to cover the dipper whenever you're not using it. Stop anyone entering it or even livestock from entering it whenever you're not using it at certain times of the year. So I suppose we said at the start, those three key things to keep in mind. That's safety of the environment, your own safety as the operator, and just the health, the welfare of the sheep as well when designing the dipping pen. So I suppose this is an example, just a quick example of a dipping pen. There's some pictures on the following slide, but I can explain this diagram just for a second first. This is quite a small dipping yard, actually, and I purposely put up a small dipping yard just because in relation to the average flock size here in Northern Ireland, and just to highlight that it can still be justifiable for 100 to 200 ewe flock, for example. It's easier for a larger flock to justify it, I suppose. So hence the reason why I thought I put a reasonably small dipper pen in, just to show that it can be equally as justifiable for a small flock. So you can see this particular dipping yard has a round dipper, a small catching pen to the right, your bigger collecting pen then below then that the sheep will enter into first, and then your two draining pens. And you see the dashed line in that then is actually is a gate. It's to signify a gate. So you'll notice that the draining pen is split into two, and the reason for that is just to give the sheep time to drain. If that wasn't split, for example, and that was just one big yard, what would happen then is whenever you finish dipping, or whenever that dipping pen was full, you'd probably be ready to turn them sheep out to the field, but your last few sheep that were through the dipper wouldn't have time to drain off then. We'd like to leave them 5 to 10 minutes in the draining pen if possible. So by splitting your draining pen, it allows you to do that. You can move one pen, empty the first pen, move your second pen into the first pen, and allows you then to continue dipping and keep the day running smoothly. A small catching pen then to put them into the dipper. Like I said, if you're designing a larger dipper pen with perhaps a long dipper, there's all sorts of things you can do, for to have them running up a race and have somewhere for a decoy sheep, for example, and then pull them down from the side and stuff into that. But this is just a small yard, a small catching pen, just to give you an indication of size. That catching pen is roughly 6 feet by 7 feet, so just a little bit bigger than the lambing pen. Hold maybe half a dozen sheep nicely, and then they can dip 2 or 3 at a time into the dipper and out into the draining pen. Draining pen obviously needs to be concrete as well. It can't be stone draining, has to be concrete to allow it to run off. And in this particular dipping yard, there's like a hump or a ramp from that right-hand draining pen, which funnels it back into the dipper. So everything in that draining pen is funneled back down into the dipper. That is just 2 photographs on the right-hand side there of that particular dipping yard. You can see from the top photograph, it's in the end of a 2-bay shed. So that gives you an indication of the size. It's about 30 foot in total in length, so it's not taking a big area. Yeah, that's your little catching pen. As I mentioned in the previous slide, this was a cover or a barrier around it is quite useful, and this is one that's done in stock boarding. So that's about waist height. There's a couple of benefits in that. One, just from your own point of view, from protect yourself against splashes. You'll obviously have your waterproofs on, but still, it helps minimize the amount of splashback you'll get when you're putting sheep into the dip. And that bottom photo that you can see that the flap hinges, so sheep are pushed in that way. And again, your frame just allows you something to hold on to that's quite sturdy. Protect yourself from any trips or slips as well. So it gives you something to hold on to. It's quite a labour-intensive day, as we mentioned. It can be heavy enough work at times. And then that's just a guillotine gate covered in stock boarding as well to keep them in the dip. So like I said, that's just a very simple, small example of a dipping yard. There's many other ones you could use, but I purposely wanted to use a small one just to be relatable to the average flock size here in Northern Ireland, and show that it can be something. It can be done on any size of sheep farm, basically. So I suppose moving on to the legislation of sheep dipping here in Northern Ireland. So basically 3 key things we need if we're going to start dipping sheep ourselves or put in a dipping yard. You'll need the certificate of competence and the safe use of sheep dips. That's a course that you'll go on to get certified to use sheep dip and to buy sheep dip. You'll need authorization from groundwater regulations to spread that dip then on the land, on your land. And you need a sheep dipper maintained in good condition. So I'll just quickly go through each of those individually. So the certificate of the competence of safe use of sheep dips. So that's a course, generally a 1-day course followed by an exam, then another day. It focuses on keeping yourself safe, others safe, the environment safe, and the chemicals used, and covers topics such as knowledge of the parasites to be controlled, looking after your sheep at dipping time, the dip products that can be used, and then what makes a good dipper design. So similar themes that we'll cover tonight in perhaps a tiny bit more detail. At the minute, I know Northern County Co-op March are offering that course. There may be others as well. Apologies if there is that I don't know about, but they're offering that course at the minute. Like I said, it's a 1-day course followed by an exam the second day, then a completion. And a successful passing of the exam, you'll then get a little card which looks like, as you see on the screen there, with your name, candidate number, and date of issue. And you'll need that then to go to purchase your dips. So when you purchase your dips from merchants, they will request your candidate number. You'll show them that, and they'll write down that candidate number and keep record of it. And there's no expiry date on it. Once you have it, you have it. Provided you don't actually lose it, as someone pointed out in Greenmount last week, it can be replaced, but it can be slightly tricky to replace by according to someone in the audience at Greenmount last week. So, like I said, once it's done, and that'll be covered then. Second thing then, I suppose, is authorization from NEA to actually spread that dip on your land. So this is a paper form, I suppose, that's filled out. You can get it on that link that's in the bottom of your screen there, that's highlighted in red. So it's a 3 to 4 page form that you'll fill out and request authorization to spread the spent dip. So in that you'll request permission to spread it on several fields. I suppose on speaking with the groundwater team prior to this meeting, I suppose they highlighted that put in as much information as possible on the form and request several fields possibly, because that'll give you more of a chance of getting one of those fields passed. They may not all be suitable, but I suppose soil type is very important there. As we said, we want to reduce the risk of dip entering the water course. So ideally, non-porous clay soils are ideal, not spread near waterways, as well as getting into the waterways. We don't want to get into the groundwater system. So shallow soils or stony ground, or shallow soils on top of, like, limestone ground, for example, or ground that's heavily drained with drainage of less than 2 feet below the ground isn't eligible either. So I suppose the groundwater team just highlighted the more information on the form, the better, and the quick that can help speed up your application then, and increase your chances of getting a couple of fields. And like I said, you can apply for 5 or 6 fields, and then you may get all 5 or 6, you may get 1 or 2. They will not actually come out and view the dipper or view your fields. It will all be done over maps and based on the information that you gave them. And basically, and it's free. It's not going to cost you anything. So yeah, and you'll have to record records then. Well, they will write back to you and give you approval, hopefully, of you can spread the dips, and then you'll receive a table of that allows you to keep records then. So you'll keep records then of where and when you spread the spent sheep dip on the ground. So I suppose spreading that then, that sheep dip would need to be diluted at a rate of 3 to 1. So that's 3 parts water or slurry and 1 part spent sheep dip. So what you do in that scenario is you'd basically reverse into the slurry tanker, fill your tanker with the dipper, and then fill it out then with 3 parts, either slurry or water, and spread it then on your designated field. So I suppose some of the regulations around that, it has to be 10 meters from a water course or 50 meters from a well, spring, or borehole. Can't be spread on ground drained at a depth of less than 2 feet or a slope greater than 11 degrees. And just same as any slurry spread, and it can't be spread in frozen or snow covered ground or waterlogged ground or ground liable to flood. So maximum application rate of before dilution of no more than 1,100 gallons per hectare, and only 1 application of sheep dip in the same area for a 12-month period. And again, like I said, maintain records of where and when that sheep dip was spread. And then the third and final thing is a sheep dipper in good condition, and whether the dipper's used or not, I suppose a dipper needs to be maintained in good condition. So, like I said, it needs to be leak proof. Needs to be free from cracks and holes in the walls and the floor that would allow the dip to escape. It must have a draining pen that's concrete and is designed that allows the dip to flow back into the bath then. And then existing baths or old baths that have drain plugs should have that plug permanently sealed unless it leads to an impermeable tank. And then I suppose just a little bit of health and safety too, and a few do's and don'ts around dipping time. So generally speaking, when you're dipping sheep, the PPE is head to toe in waterproofs, but slightly different. I suppose the waterproofs that a lot of us wear around the farm would be breathable material. Unfortunately, for a sheep dip, it has to be non-breathable material, and that's just to protect yourself. So I'm sure you've all heard stories of people getting sick and ill from getting covered in sheep dip. So we want to prevent that. It is highly toxic stuff, and we want to prevent that getting onto yourself and getting onto your skin. So it's PVC or nitrile is the material that we need the waterproofs to be made of, and they're not breathable, and that'll just help protect yourself. Wellington boots as well. Your leggings should be outside your Wellington boots, as most people wear them, but occasionally you see people tuck them in the inside of the Wellingtons. That can't do that whenever you're dipping sheep, because then the dip would possibly run inside your Wellington if it gets splashed back into you. So Wellington leggings outside the Wellington boots. Gloves as well. So again, PVC or nitrile. Whenever you buy dip, you should be supplied with the correct style of glove. So the heavy gauntlet style gloves that go up kind of halfway up your arm, and a baby apron over as well. And a face shield is actually necessary whenever you're handling dip concentrates. So whenever you're actually filling up the dip, it's not mandatory whenever you're dipping sheep, but it's a good idea to have it on when you're dipping sheep. Like splashes can happen, big splashes can happen. We obviously want to stop that getting onto your skin. So a face shield is a good idea whenever you're dipping sheep as well for that reason. And again, I suppose just a few do's and don'ts around dipping time. The key rule, the golden rule, Stuart highlighted very well. Sheep need to be immersed on for at least 1 minute with your heads plunged twice in that time. And again, that can be tricky, that can be challenging, I know, but I suppose it's just a way we have to work with the sheep. You don't force them, don't hold them down to make them swallow the dip. We try to work with them best you can. Get the head down, plunged, a good plunge twice, and that's to get into the ears. Inside the ear canal is actually a favorite place for the mites to go. So that'll help kill them. And I suppose that's one of the benefits in the dip over the shower as well, to to really get the head down and get that dip into the ears. But Stuart actually had a very good slide there. I thought where if a sheep is only dipped for 20 seconds, 50% of the active ingredient is then absorbed by the sheep, or 40 seconds, 38% less is absorbed by the sheep. So, if we think about that in terms of, say, for fluking sheep this time of year, you're not going to go out and give your ewes half a fluke dose, because that'll be pointless. That won't have worked. But it's the same in dipping sheep. We need to make sure they're in for that 1 minute, and 1 minute is actually a long time. So we need some way to keep track of that. So whether it's a stopwatch around your neck, whatever the case may be, stopwatch around your neck is probably the best way. It saves you, hooking at your phone whenever you have gloves on, and then potentially getting dip onto that. But we need some way of keeping track of that minute. And then releasing the sheep into a draining pen and the holding pen afterwards. Like we said, a good 5 to 10 minutes, and that's the benefit of having a split draining pen. Then it allows your day to run freely. And you're not waiting on the last few sheep to dip, waiting for 5 minutes. You can just keep your draining pen free, keep them moved along, and you're capturing all that dip, and it's not going out into the environment. Topping up your dip in line with manufacturer's instructions. I think for general size dippers for golden fleece, it'll be once every 36 sheep, I think it is. It'll increase if you have a larger dipper size possibly. But again, we need a way of keeping track of that, keeping track of those 36 sheep or whatever it is. So, if you're dipping them in 2s and 3s, it can be slightly easier. Counted 2, 3, 6, 9, 12 is slightly easier to keep track of. Or obviously, you see dippers have those tally counters, the same as the sheep shearers have as well. But we need some way of keeping track of that, and making sure that we maintain the dipper with the right concentration of sheep dip. As Stuart highlighted as well, making sure that dip bath is clean at all times. So Stuart said, if that goes on to a next day, cleaning that out and starting again. I appreciate sometimes that can be frustrating if you've only dipped 300, 400 sheep, and that could have done an extra 100 or 2. But unfortunately, when you're dipping sheep, a good bit of feces will enter the dipping tank, some wool, some organic material, and that's when you get your bacteria multiplying from that. And then if sheep are going in with open wounds, perhaps even something that you can't see in the feet, that's where you'll get your post-dip and lameness and your swollen joints and stuff like that. If we're subjecting sheep to that bacteria, so you'll run into further problems down the line. So very, very important to start off with a fresh bath, and each day start off with a fresh bath. And I think as Stuart had it in one of his slides there, for a 1,000-litre tank, I think it is every 500 sheep, we should be replenishing that and starting off and fresh. Don't mix dipped sheep with undipped sheep. So ideally, we'll be dipping all our sheep in one day to mitigate against that. I appreciate with larger flocks or if sheep are scattered, that's not possible sometimes. But I suppose just not letting them mix. So if one batch, one field is dipped, that field's dipped. Nothing enters that field then until they're dipped. And as you're highlighted, nothing even comes on the neighbouring fence as well. Ideally, if they're not dipped, and that'll keep your biosecurity right. Sheep should have at least 3 weeks wool regrowth, or at least 1 centimeter, and then that's just allow the dip to work. The dip needs to attach to the wool. So we need a reasonable covering to allow you to do that for your persistence. And as we said, highlight don't dip sheep that have open wounds or sores, ideally. So straight after shearing, for example, isn't an ideal time for both of those reasons. And again, just general things, I suppose, don't dip sheep if they're ill, unless it's caused by scab, for example, or external parasites. If sheep are at a vulnerable stage of pregnancy, I suppose it's not ideal. It's a bit rough on them. Perhaps then injecting with your moxidectin might be an option to go if it's in the later stage of pregnancy anyway. Don't dip sheep when they're stressed, eating, or thirsty. So just common sense things. If sheep have a long walk home, for example, don't put them straight into the dipping yard and straight into the dipper. Put them into the shed under a roof. Let them catch their breath. Well, there's a drinker there as well. Hopefully, let them have a drink. Let them catch their breath, and then dip them after a wee while. Bear in mind your withdrawal period as well for fat lambs or cull ewes, for example. And just common sense things. If sheep are wet, obviously we want the active ingredient on the wool and the wool to hold it. So we want dry wool for that to happen. And again, the same goes if there's heavy rain due in the forecast. You're not going to go out spraying weeds if there's heavy rain due in a couple of hours' time. So we hopefully wouldn't be dipping sheep if that case as well. And just general common sense around things like that. And that's me, I suppose. Just a few quick tips there on dipping sheep, following on from Stuart's presentation, and a few tips in designing your own dipping pen. Listen to contractor provides invaluable service and is a great option. But I suppose putting up your own dipping pen is something that could be considered and could be cost effective in the long run, even for the average to small sized sheep flock. So I think that brings us on to the question and answer session. Michael, I'll try to stop sharing my screen here.
Thanks very much, Gareth. Maybe just to let you catch your breath for a wee second, we can get some of the questions that have come in for Stewart. Suppose just to start off with, there's a question here: can wildlife act as a host to keep the mite alive until it finds a sheep? I think that's been asked a few times over the course of the in-person nights and the webinar tonight, Stewart. So happy to hear your answer on that.
Thanks, Michael. It's a good question, and it's one that we hear a lot because, of course, I guess that should always be, we should think about what the threats are, but in reality, I would say that that's probably pretty minimal. So these mites will infest things like rabbits, but again, the chances of an infested rabbit getting into your flock and then passing on to sheep are really, really small. And by far the biggest risk is what I've spoken about, kind of bounding with other flocks and bringing, kind of animals onto your property. Those are your big risks. People ask about, kind of things like, can crows bring it in by dropping, bits of wool from one flock to another? Of course, it can happen. That can happen, but the chances are pretty slim, of that happening. So it's all. I think when we're dealing with sort of, disease control, it should all be about risk. And so, what are the highest risks, and think about those, and that's really where our efforts will be best served. Thinking about those boundaries and thinking about what we are intentionally bringing onto our property. So yeah.
Thanks, Stuart. And maybe just another one for you at this stage. Is there any known resistance to dip?
So at this stage in the UK, no. However, they use the same chemicals in places like South America. In South America, there is now evidence of resistance to the organophosphates in these mites. So they're very capable of developing resistance to these drugs, and they will, because basically if we keep giving them, if we keep using things like showers and jetters and giving them subtherapeutic doses, and as we've shown with the injectables, if we underdose, which we've been doing quite a lot, then resistance will come. You know, the benefit that these parasites have is they have very large population sizes. So on one sheep, a very heavily infested sheep, you could have hundreds of thousands of mites. And so the chances of one of those mites in there having a genetic change that gives it resistance, you know, are quite high. And so if we then mistreat that, then that mite population will then all the susceptible ones will die off, and the resistant ones will stay, and then they're the ones that will then develop, and then we get into issues of resistance. So at the moment, no. Will there ever be? Yes. Yeah, it will come at some point. What I want it to be is 10 years, 20 years down the line, and not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the line. And that's really what we need to try and protect. So.
Yeah, and I suppose that takes us on to the whole planning around dipping and dipping properly. And, you know, there's a question about how often should sheep be dipped. And I suppose you could maybe cover a little bit of, you know, do you dip prophylactically? Do you dip even if you feel there's no risk, just because you want to minimize it?
Sure.
Could you maybe expand on that a wee bit, please?
Yeah. So look, if because people will dip for lots of other reasons as well, you know, and so they may dip at different times of the year to control other parasites. So, but in terms of sheep scab, and again looking at risk, the highest risk is as we move into autumn. Tupping, because we've got lots of animal movements at that time of year, and that increases the risk of scab spreading about. So that is the time of year to do that coordinated dipping, is really around, you know, depending on when you're tupping, but I would say around sort of September, October, and as we're seeing on Lewis here, we've been doing it in November on Harris. So around that autumn season, because then what you're doing is you're dealing with it at that high risk time, and you're giving then your flock the greatest opportunity to stay free of sheep scab as they move into those winter months when we know scab will be at its highest levels. And that's what we want to do. So we want to avoid scab getting a foothold in those months so it doesn't then manifest itself at lambing. That's what we need to avoid, because if you get into that situation, then it is really, really challenging. And I saw there's another question down the bottom there, Michael, which kind of links nicely into that, which is around what stage of pregnancy to dip use. And you kind of mentioned that, and Gareth mentioned that, you know, about obviously being very careful with heavily pregnant sheep. If it's one of these sort of cage type systems where you're lowering the animals into the dip tank, then, you know, we've seen very heavily pregnant sheep put through there perfectly safely, you know, but you just need to manage them very carefully, keep the numbers down, do it, you know, carefully and slowly, and manage the animals through, you know, very, very, you know, sort of, you know, very carefully, bearing in mind their condition, and then monitor them afterwards as well, of course, you know. So, but we've certainly seen very heavily pregnant animals go through these dips. But look, you know, it's probably going to be more of a risk if they're going into one where they're plunging into the tank and they're thrashing about a little bit, and then they've got to climb up those steps afterwards. If they're very heavily pregnant, you probably want to avoid that situation. But the cage type systems, I would be much more comfortable with that. Yeah.
Okay, and just before I move to Gareth, there's a question here about resistance to Dictamax.
Yeah.
You know, obviously we've been talking about the OP and using that properly. Is there, you know, could you expand on the Dictamax question?
Yeah. So look, Dictamax is the active that's in Dictamax basically targets the same part of the parasite as the active in Cydectin and the active in the ivermectin based. They all use the same active basically, and so resistance to one is resistance to all. The issue with Dictamax is that, of course, if you're injecting to treat for scab, it works really well. You know, it's a great chemical for treating sheep scab. but you don't get that persistence. And so what you need to do is just make sure that if you can't move your sheep, you do not use Dectomax, because it's just a recipe for just, reinfesting your animals. More of an issue, I would say, in terms of developing resistance are things like the ivermectin type drugs, where you've got to give 2 injections. And the issue there is that if you give the first injection, the drug does not kill the eggs of the parasite. So the eggs are laid on the skin, and so you give that first dose, and it will kill the moving stages, but it won't kill the eggs. And so by the time the active comes down in its efficacy, the eggs will hatch, and that's why you have to give that second dose about 2 weeks apart, because then it allows you to kill those eggs that are then hatching. And if you don't do that, that's where you get resistance, because then those eggs will hatch. The drug is coming down, it's at a subtherapeutic dose, and those parasites, some of those parasites will then survive, even though you've got some drug there, but it's down at a subtherapeutic level. That's where you get the resistance happening. So that's why we have to be super careful about using things like ivermectin. And more often than not, people will give it 1 dose. They'll see an improvement because it will kill those moving parasites. But if you don't give the second dose and you don't treat every animal, it will just come back and you'll push resistance.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. And just moving maybe to Gareth here now, I've just a couple of questions on dipping and the process. If you're using a mobile dipping contractor, does the farmer have to have the NIEA approval to dispose of the dip? And as a follow-up to that question, maybe also you could cover putting dip into a slurry tank.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Michael. Yeah, with this, that's probably a common one that would this talk in Lockery last week, then Greenmount, and I think that those questions came up at both those events. So there's a third time, so it's a common enough question. So I suppose there's a conversation to be had. Firstly, if the dip is spread on your land, then it's your responsibility to have that groundwater authorization in place. And like I said, it's free. We're a wee bit lucky in that sense in this country, and in other countries it's not free, and there's a more arduous process to go through to get it. So it's just a matter of applying for it and hoping that you've soil types and then fields that are suitable. So yeah, it's a conversation to be had. Just from speaking to farmers around the country, some dipping contractors will take it away and some dippers won't. So it's a matter of having that conversation prior to them coming to dip in the sheep, and then having the plan in place to deal with it. But yes, if that spent sheep dip is spread on your ground, then you will that's your responsibility to have that in place. And yeah, and the slurry tank that came up with Greenmount last week as well. So unfortunately, if a spent dip is put into a slurry tank, then that whole slurry tank will be classified as spent dip. So that's hence why I said what you would do with a dipper anyway. You would fill your slurry tanker, sorry, out of the dipper, and then fill that tanker with water or slurry then, so you wouldn't be putting the dip into the slurry tank itself. So you'd be filling your tanker first for the dip, and then filling it out with slurry or water, because if that dip entered the tank, then that whole tank would be classified as spent sheep dip, and you're unlikely to have that area of ground to authorized to handle spent sheep dip. So yeah, that answers that hopefully.
Yeah, thanks, Gareth. And I suppose a minute seems like a long time when you're standing looking at the sheep in the dipper. You're maybe looking at sheep either that have been through, that you need to get away back to where they came from, or a whole pile of sheep waiting to come in. Could you maybe just expand a wee bit on how important that minute is?
Yeah, no, a minute is a long time. I appreciate that, and I appreciate dipping is it's an all day job. Like, it's a big job. It's not a small undertaking really. So you need to clear that time to allow yourself time to do it properly. But I think Stuart's slide highlighted very well. So if a sheep are in the dipping bath for 20 seconds, only 50% of the product goes on to that sheep then. So how sheep dip works is it attaches itself to the lanolin. The lanolin is like the grease in sheep's wool. So it attaches itself onto that, and it needs time to do that. So I suppose if we're only getting 50% or in around that of product onto the sheep, then as Stuart highlighted, that's how resistance spreads basically. And as sheep farmers, we know we've had enough problems with resistance when we think of our wormers and fungicides. And Stuart, as in the previous question highlighted, there is resistance to OP dip in other countries, not in Northern Ireland. So we want to keep it that way. We don't want to add sheep scab or sheep dip onto that list because it'll lead to all sorts of problems. So yeah, that's the importance of keeping them in that 1 minute, and also plunging the head down twice because the ears are a common place for the mites to live, and that's what the plunge dipper is wins over the showering. So yeah, appreciate it's a long time, but it's a matter of trying to get away our system. Whether a stopwatch around the neck is probably the easiest way, because then that just lives in the farm somewhere, and that's just for that job. It avoids getting your phone involved or things like that, and then you know it's done then.
Yeah, I think if you've gone to the bother of actually having a dipping facility, you've gone to the bother of deciding to dip and buying the dip, and you've brought the sheep in. It's just so important to take the time to do it properly. This is maybe a question for Gareth or Stuart, or both, if you've got if you have an opinion on this. The dipping sheep, if you have the sheep comes in and she's in the dip for the full minute, and the idea is to get the dip right down to the skin level. After dipping, is rain an issue, and for how long after dipping is rain an issue? I suppose we can have weather that comes unexpectedly, and it seems of late, when it rains, and I suppose what are the risks around that? If you've got the treatment right down to the skin, does the wool then protect it a little bit?
Yeah, hopefully Stuart will have some I suppose more information or experience on how long we ideally need to keep them dry. But I suppose just one point to make is that's one of the benefits of having your own sheep dipper yourself. You're less reliant on other people then, because if you've, say, for example, a day booked off work or someone booked in to come to dip your sheep that particular day, and then the forecast changes, well, you have a lot of things to rejig then and around. So if you have your own way of working, at least it's one less person to work around. So it's one benefit there, and it obviously does. It's not ideal. We want it to dry to go on dry and stay on dry. But I don't know if you have anything to add on that, Stuart.
Yeah, I mean, it's just you're entirely right, Gareth. I mean, it's as much as you can avoid, dipping when there's been rain, when there's going to be rain, or when there's rain coming, and where you can avoid that, do so. But of course, we can't always do that. The advantage is that active is getting taken up into the wool grease, and so to some extent, it's going to be difficult to simply just wash all of that off with rain. The fleeces will have had a good chance to kind of to dry out, hopefully through the draining pens, and then as they get taken out. And so generally, you're not going to see all of that active washed away. It will still, I would think, result in treatment, but what you might see is a reduction in that 8 weeks of protection. If you get that kind of heavy rain, kind of shortly after dipping, you might just see that they're not protected for quite as long as you had hoped in that case. But generally, the active will get down to the skin level and will have the impact that we want it to have on the parasites that are there. But again, avoid it where you can. But I appreciate you can't always do so.
Okay, I've got two more questions for you. One is about injectables, and the question in here, I'm just struggling to read it correctly, and if I'm wrong, put it in again. If injected is used over a long period of time, is there a chance of removing worm resistance in your sheep?
So the answer there is no, but there is a possibility. Remember that it's the same active again. In this ML, most of the MLs are wormers as well. So the danger there comes from using things like the long-acting Cydectin, because we're using it. Let's say for scab, we're using it at this time of year. It persists. It's a long-acting drug. We're hoping it's going to persist, but we don't know what the implications are then for that drug tailing off through the winter and into spring when worms are going to become more of a problem. Are we then giving exposure to subtherapeutic levels then for the worms that are inside the sheep's stomach and intestines, and that's something we need more information about. So it's a really good point, really good question, but it's something we need more information around. What are the implications of using some of these drugs, not just on sheep scab, but on other parasites? And again, I think that just reiterates why whenever we can, we should be dipping. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for that, Stuart. Just one final question, and I suppose this is something that people will wonder if they've had scab outbreaks, or if they're, the issue you mentioned about shearers and so on coming in. And again, this has been asked a number of times over the course of the three nights. The best way, if you have a mobile dipper coming and you're just not 100% sure that everything's as clean as it should be, or your shearer coming, do you use disinfectant to get rid of the mites, or what's the solution there?
Yeah. So look, yeah, you can use disinfectants. We know some disinfectants that will work against the mites, but they take time. They need contact time, and so that's a challenge. It's again, if we go back to that issue of risk, so if to mitigate that risk, to lessen that risk, your best sort of weapon in that battle is a jet wash. It's simple power washer, because, or ideally a steam washer, that'd be fantastic. But even a jet washer, because what that's going to do is help you move most of the risk. Because remember, the risk in a handling facility is going to be bits of wool that have mites on them. And so if you're just simply cleaning down as best as you can there, removing all those visible parts of wool, then you're reducing that risk massively. So that is your best friend. Do not slosh about diluted sheep dip, because look, it's a really toxic chemical. You do not want to be sending that around, and it's not going to work because of that contact time issue. And so the best weapon is a jet wash.
Okay, thank you very much, Stuart. We've gone through all the questions there, and I suppose I would just like to thank Stuart and to Gareth for their interesting talks, and for the insights that we've had. Scab is not an issue that's going to go away. And it's something that I suppose you've really highlighted in your presentation, Stuart, that it's not going to go away if people just kind of do things on their own. So it's really important that we work together. And I suppose there's been a number of conversations that we've had over the last week or so, and I suppose that's why I just put the slide up with the various people who have helped us in organising these three events. And I suppose it's really key that farmers cooperate together, but also the industry cooperates together, and hopefully there are things that can be done going forward. As we raise awareness and people have a better understanding that the knowledge of how important it is to work together and cooperate is just really key to this. So on that note, I'd just like to finally thank everyone, and also just a further thank you to Kelly and to Ruth from the Farmers Union for hosting us tonight, and hopefully there'll be lots of good take-home messages that people will be going away and thinking about. So thank you very much, everyone. Yeah, I was going to say safe home, but most of you probably are already there. Thank you.
Thank you.